of the Lucan parables and kind of uses what he talked about in the beginning to kind of analyze it.
So if you were gonna, that's one book I've read. I've read that before. If you were gonna, what's the most interesting thing that you've discovered so far in your reading? What is there something like he's written? And you're like, wow, that's something I didn't appreciate or didn't.
I guess like the way he talks about like different literary forms.
Okay.
And like in John and Luke especially, like when he gives the examples of just kind of introducing them, like it's kind of interesting how you see like just like a couple verses it can be like he uses inverse parallelism or
Right.
inverse something like that.
Uh-huh.
Inverse, and it's kind of interesting how like even only in like a sentence or two there's like 4 or 5 different ideas that are being inversed and like in with the middle being kind of the.
Back in the day, he was known for his chiasms. He would talk about inverse parallelism and chiasm. A chiasm is when you have literary points that like move to a climactic middle point. So it's like point A to point B to point C to point C to point B to point A, and you focus the literary rhetorical focus is on that middle piece. I watch scholars have a field day with that, finding chiasms everywhere. And sometimes I'm like, okay, really? Because that's just, you're making too much of it, right? But that was very popular. One of the things that I appreciated about Bailey's work is his knowledge about the Near East, Middle East culture when he interprets the parables, especially the one on the prodigal son. It's just fantastic, and that's the whole honor shame society where he traces down the other one he does is, I don't know if he does it in this book or another one, but he talks about the marriage and how the marriage house was prepared, like to give you a sense of like Joseph and the preparations that would have been made for that couple. But so very good. I'll look forward to that. Who else has you? Go ahead.
I also think on the board, they do talk about cousins, simple and how it relates to the parables itself.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite was the unjust steward.
Okay, the unjust steward.
Wait, why? I don't say this parable because it's like, wait, you're honoring dishonesty and cheating and lying. So I'm like, what it is? Then I was reading parables, trying to sort of explain to that simple. He explained how in different cultures, the steward is, either looked up to as or hated or but I do know one thing I did like about it was when they said, what the parable kind of like, for example, the master was God, and the person himself was, us as a man, and how we do something bad, and God still loves us, he's not, he didn't get punished like he should, like he's in from jail, he doesn't get punished, nothing like this. Still, even after being dismissed, go ahead and try to get more people, and even though that happened, nothing bad happens to him. So.
That's got to be one of the most difficult parables to understand, the unjust steward, because it looks like the guy has just committed larceny. He's defrauded his master, and then at the end, the master's like, "Good on you, buddy." I know. I still can't make adequate sense of that. Even N.T. Wright's suggestion about that parable falls short. So Bailey's argument about that, I think he's noticing all the features and pointing out how different context is for us and for the first century audience, where clientele, this guy's got to manage his own life after this. And so what he's trying to do is build up his network in a way that's going to allow him to survive, as opposed to just being dismissed and being left with nothing. It's fascinating. I still don't know that I get it, or that I'm persuaded, but I understand. So very good. Someone else, what book are you reading? And that's what we're doing. For those of you on Google Meeting, I apologize if the audio is a little unclear. So what I'll do is somebody on Google Meeting go, and you tell me what you're reading, and we'll go one at a time. Just unmute and blab away. This is an awkward silence. This is awkward.
I can go.
Okay, great. Thank you,
Um,
Gianna.
So I'm reading the short stories by Jesus, the enigmatic parables of a controversial rabbi.
Okay.
And I'm like probably like 1/3 like through with it, like taking notes and stuff, but like I didn't really understand like that people had like problems with the parables, and I think it's really interesting that like she like explains how it was supposed to be viewed in like the original like Jewish audience, like how they took it versus how we do it, and how like there's such like a gap.
Hmm. And when, I don't know about you, because I'm not sure where everybody is in terms of your church going or whatever, but when you go to a church and you listen to somebody talk about the parables, invariably they goof it up. Like they goof it up. They don't get the original context. And what I think your author is Amy Jill Levine, right? And what she gets right is she, like Bailey too, they're trying to set these parables in that context so we understand the greater symbolic value that it is. So one of the first people to do this, he wrote a little book called, he wrote a little book called The Parables of Jesus. I think it was Joachim Jeremias. It's this little book, and a similar situation. He's writing before Bailey and before Amy Jill Levine. Let's see. I think we got. Okay, so Gianna Haskell. Gianna, can you are you able to use your mic? Gianna Haskell. Okay, so your mic isn't working. She's reading the Jesus I Never Knew, and yeah, the Jesus. What I like about the Jesus I Never Knew. Now that's not, and it's not like the deepest book you ever read, but it does. It poses a very interesting set of cultural questions, where Philip Yancey puts our notion of Jesus next to the biblical one and seeks to find out all of the ways in which we screw it up and some of the ways we get it right. And he uses film to do it. He goes through like the historical the Jesus films, and points it out. I really enjoyed that book, as well as he did come out with a companion video for it. And years ago, I did that with a church group. I walked them through that. It's an interesting book. Yancey was an extremely influential writer with the evangelical world from Christianity Today. He has since left that kind of organization and that movement. So good for him. But yeah, you'd like that book. If that's a book you could easily handle after this class, easily handle. Philip Yancey, The Jesus I Never Knew. And it's interesting. He's a good writer. That's kind of the point too. He's not like a writer that you'll not understand or is writing, soaring above your head, anything like that. So that was one. That's two from the online session. Somebody from the, yes, go ahead. So Zealot by Reza Aslan. Yes.
Yeah, he's like an Iranian.
Mhm. Yep.
Which, like, going into it, I kind of thought maybe he was gonna have more like, but like to be honest, it's not really
Right.
that.
Right.
It's more like I feel like he sets up like Palestine and like the social like norms of like Jesus on like really well. It's like obviously like when we read the Bible, go like look at anything, definitely stuff like from Paul.
Right. Yes, I do. So you expect with Aslan's book, Reza Aslan's book, and this was the initial reaction to it, was that this person would be providing a book that we would want to get rid of or object to. It's not that way at all. Yeah. So what did you think about his background? Because he gives a little bit of his background there. He grew up in a Christian home, and then kind of left it, and now he's a Muslim.
But it's kind of like, that's like, I feel like it was just shocking.
Right.
And then, but like it, I don't know, I feel like it doesn't have as much effect on it as I thought it would on the font, how he writes the book. Do you like it? I think that, it definitely, I feel like looking at it and like, I definitely think about Jesus in a different way now. Right? Because like, I always like, look at it like from, I'm coming from this 2022 or whatever,
Yeah.
here. And I bring certain biases in when I look at things. So, like, it kind of like made me think about it. Like, oh, like really, like Jesus had brothers and he had like his, like you know, they call like Jesus like the son of his mother, right?
Right.
Just like you can kind of be like an insult, like his explanation for like why they called him that. Explanation for like, right? Obviously, his mother not a virgin because she had a bunch of brothers and sisters.
Right. So good. And let's see. So you're doing, Jack, can you make your mic go? Because I would love to hear hear you talk about this, given your major. Hoping you can give us a few minutes on your mic. Jack, are you there? Jack, okay, he's going to try to come back in. He's doing the same book, Jesus I Never Knew. And he's doing it because as a film and TV major, he thought that would be an interesting, I think I agree with him. I think that'd be very interesting. He's going to try to come back in. In the meantime, I'm trying to get this lecture onto this computer, and I'm not having very much success here on Epiphany Stories. So let me see if I've loaded it onto the. That have trouble. I always have trouble. So someone else talk to me about. Adam, you got a book? What book are you reading? Oh, did you? Is this Jack?
Yeah,
You're loud and clear, man.
thank you. I'm doing the Jesus I Never Knew.
Yeah.
And I just found it really interesting to see how like TV, how like film has really had an impact in it. Because in my major, it's not really something that's ever brought up. Like it's just something that I've always been interested in.
Did you have a chance to look at the did you have a chance to look at some of the videos?
Not yet, but I was going to do that over the study days.
Right. Okay. Because to me, it's so interesting to watch him do that. And I always get these things from. Somebody left this on my car, and it was a DVD of 3 Jesus movies with an invitation to their church, which cracks me up because I'm not going to go because I have 2 churches I have to take care of myself. But I kept the DVD because I'm like, I could show this to my classes. So I'd be interested. I'm interested in your take on those and on the videos. I'm glad you were able to identify that. And so good. And I'm going to go back to Adam. Adam had, he was going to talk to us. He read Schweitzer. That's Eduard Schweitzer. Can you talk about that?
So like the chapters are sort of like different topics. Like the first chapter discusses like where we are like social function like Jesus church. So you talk about
Right.
like different Jesus like their findings, I guess.
Yeah.
And then chapters after that you sort of talk about like the different parables and
I like that he puts it that way. Jesus is the parable of God, because our temptation is to make the gospel story into a literal blow-by-blow description. And what Schweitzer recognizes is that the life of Jesus in the gospels is itself a parable of sorts. And that's very interesting. Do you like the book?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. Okay. Someone else. Go ahead, David.
It's during Jesus and Pilgrim, James Martin.
Yeah.
First, I was afraid of the book because it's too long. Sunday, during on the Sunday of the morning sun, I happened to.
Oh, wow.
I was interested in reading the book, and what captured me most was how he went to the Holy Land.
Right.
It's the way he writes the book. All the places that Jesus went. So when you are reading it, it's like you're having the scriptures in your hands at the same time.
Now, David's reflecting on James Martin, Jesus a Pilgrimage, and James Martin uses his own visit to the Holy Land, the description of the physical area with the accompanying scriptures. Can I give you something that you might be interested in trying? And that is, while you're reading the book or on your own at some other time, using the power of YouTube, which Elon Musk so far has not bought, you can use the power of YouTube, and you can look for pilgrimages that people have taken to those sites, and you put them on your screen, and you just inhabit those spaces for a few minutes. Some of them are great. Some of them you like next, but a lot of them are quite interesting, and it does help. It helps to fire the imagination. And I like you called it. It's a big book. It is a big book, but it's readable, David. It's readable. It's a good readable book. Yeah. Someone else. Yes. That's right. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Is it? I've told you my story about the guy smoking a cigarette over top of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Did I ever tell you that? How I went to the exhibit, the Dead Sea Scroll exhibit, and they're showing a movie, and there's Catholic priest. I can only imagine who it is. I have an idea who it is, and because there are only a few of them in there, right? So it's at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, where you can find the Silas Dogood letters, and that'll trace a map to get to the treasure beyond all treasures, because there's a map on the back of the Declaration of Independence. But that's a different story. Anyway, I went to I'm watching this little movie, and during the movie, this guy is a priest, because he's got the garb on, and he's got this, and he's got an ash on his cigarette. It has to be that long, just hanging over top of these 2,000-year-old scrolls. like watching it, I was so apprehensive that it was going to fall and burn the things up. I'm like, my gosh. And the whole time I kept thinking, do you know what that's doing to your lungs? That's not true. I was like, that could burn up the whole scroll. Who cares about his health? But anyway, so you like has it been challenging for you to read, or? Okay. Very good. Very good. Let's see. Someone else has written. Dana she's reading The Apocalyptic Jesus by Marcus Borg and Dale Allison. That's a big, heavy lifting book. But it is a book that was based on their talks. So it's not totally inscrutable, but I can't figure out where I am in terms of apocalyptic, honestly, as a scholar. Apocalyptic is super, super popular right now. People are falling out of bed and writing dissertations on apocalyptic stuff. My problem is, when I read the apocalypses themselves, First Enoch, the Book of Revelation, First Enoch is the biggest one, Baruch, it's just not the same thing. It's not the same thing, which is not to say that Jesus wasn't apocalyptic. Of course, Jesus had elements of apocalyptic in his thinking, just the Dead Sea Scrolls too. But that doesn't mean that they're thoroughly steeped in it. And sometimes I think that it's just too much. But, it'll be the next thing, whatever the next fad is, what it'll be. But I always react a little bit in that against that. But Dale Allison, of course, not only is he a great scholar, but he's also a Steelers fan. I mean, so he's got to be close to the Lord. You know what I'm saying? I heard him. We were sitting in a conference at Columbia, and he's talking. He just moved to Princeton from Pittsburgh Seminary. I told him from Pittsburgh, and he's like, "Oh, you like the Steelers?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's not from the area, but when you go there, you catch it. It's like a disease, a 6-time championship disease, I might add. So every time they're on the Super Bowl, I'm like, oh, I'm going to nurse my broken heart by watching one of the Super Bowls they already have. Okay, Jets fans. So they have that one that they got Broadway Joe, who is also from Western Pennsylvania. Let's hear another one. Somebody else. Yes, go ahead. Okay. Yes. Right.
I have no idea then.
Right. Right. Yeah, there are lots of Christians have no idea what millenarianism is, and then someone throws it in there and they just nod and keep going. You're right about that. Thank you for bringing that up. In your notes, if you catalog those terms that you have to look up, I mean, that'll go a long way, because sometimes it's a lot. Millenarianism is the belief in the millennia, where Jesus comes back. That's one way of looking at it. Crozan is enormously interesting. John Dominic Crozan. He, if you're interested in some of this stuff, there is a podcast. It's called Homebrewed Theology, and on the podcast for Homebrewed Theology, this guy, he's pretty entertaining. He interviews people, and he's got an hour and a half with John Dominic Crozan on the historical Jesus, which is very interesting, eminently understandable. There are a number of his podcasts that deal with that. And, one thing I'd ask you guys to think about to help me with is how could I integrate some of that kind of content into the course? Because I was thinking that the whole time, and then I come across Trip Fuller's podcast and he's got these major figures, and I'm wondering how I could incorporate that in a meaningful way. So if you have a thought about that, let me know. I really appreciate your input. And especially after this class, you will be eminently more qualified to listen and to understand some of the major, you will already know some of the major issues regarding the historical Jesus, gospel research. And I want to say there's so much that we didn't even get to. And so that's where the nomenclature gets really, I think it bogs the whole area down, to be honest with you. We could do this in a lot more simple way. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah. Well, good for you, and good for Dana for picking an ambitious book. It's meant to stretch you. You're not being graded on how well or how poorly you understand it. You're being graded on stretching yourself and learning. So I really do applaud the effort. Somebody else is reading another book like that. I think we covered everybody here. Anybody else on the Google meeting have a book you want to tell me about? Awkward silence. So I think you have till the 13th. That's the day that I can't take anything beyond the day, not because I'm unfriendly, but because that's the day I have to submit I think that's it. The day I have to submit the grades. So please get those things done. A note to those of you who are within earshot, and that is, I will take work until the end. You cannot leave an assignment open. A 0, you cannot have a 0. So if there's something if you didn't get a grade from me for something, that means that I don't know it exists, or I didn't grade it yet and you need me to grade it. I did grade 3 today because I'm so great. I was like, I can't believe I haven't. I apologize. You two especially. I apologize to you guys. You handed it right on the due date and they were stuck in my folder. And when I looked at the 2, right, I thought, oh, I graded those already because they also submitted them online. No, you hadn't. So I'm sorry about that. I hope you can exercise a little grace. And the work you've done also is very good. So I'm very encouraged by that. So you have to get that work done. You want the good news or the bad news? There's no good news. There's no bad news. There's just news. That's from Kung Fu Panda. And then he says, Tai Lung has escaped. And he goes, oh, that is bad news. One of my favorite lines from a Buddhist. He's supposed to be Buddhist, right? And he says, there is no new bad news. There's no good news. There's just news. Tai Lung has escaped. Oh, that is bad news. Yes. I think I had them due next week, right? The 2nd or the 5th or something. And but I can take them till the 13th. You know. I guess one student took me to task over my due dates, and I apologized. I said, I've never been a stickler for the due date because I know how difficult your lives are. I mean, if I had everybody, I don't know how to express it, but the reason I don't do that is because, you know, you guys have stuff that comes due as well, and you didn't get to read your book until this week, and now you're trying to. I don't want it half-baked. I don't want it that way. I want you to be able to do it successfully. So if I have to give you a few more days, I'm happy to do that. So that's a good question and a terrible answer. So the news is I'm going to change the format of the 3rd quiz just a little bit. There will be some essay questions involved on the 3rd quiz. I want to see you put together information. Now, I'm not going to leave you in the dark. So what I plan to do is I'm going to give you a list of like 5 to 10 possibilities for short essay, long essay kinds of questions. And you'll have that list so that you can start putting together some thoughts about how you're going to do it. You still have access to all your readings, all your notes. You can quote the book you read. I'm happy to have your research come to bear on the answers you provide. This will give you an opportunity to be a little more creative and well-spoken. Some of you are very good with the putting the words together thing. So it's not just a word salad. It's actually I like that. Somebody said word salad. I didn't know what the heck they were talking about. So I looked it up. And you got to be careful when you look stuff up on Urban Dictionary. But I did look it up, and I could tolerate that one. So that way, when I give you the topics, you can begin to put them together. I think that's fair. And then what I'll do on the quiz is I have to figure it out on those quizzes when you do them online. Sometimes the computer doesn't like here, pick one. So but that's what I like to do. I like to, here are 4 essays, pick 2. That's what I like to do. Because then you could prepare for 4, but then there are 2 you're like, oh, I could really write well on these 2. That's what I like. I don't like, here's 4, give me 4 really terrible answers. I'm not too into that. It's not fair either. So, but I'll let you know as soon as I'm going to go back and rework the quiz. There are some aspects from the quiz as I've delivered them that haven't delivered what I wanted. So that'll be there. The other thing, I think our quiz will be is it on the 11th, the final? Is that when ours is? Is that it? Usually I'm going to give you at least 12. I'm going to give you at least 24 hours. I might give you 36, and then a 4-hour limit. And the reason I'm giving you a 4-hour limit is because I like you. I do not want you spending 8 hours trying to agonize over this thing. You get 4 hours, take your best shot and get it done. That's all. It's merciful, right? It shouldn't be any longer than the other quizzes. Because I'm letting you develop your essay questions before you get there. So this should be easy to get them written. Writing counts. Putting your words together thing matters. So please do that with all diligence. Yes. There'll be something like that. Yes, multiple choice, and then some. And I got to tell you this too. I've really enjoyed this class. I've had a bad week. I've gotten ripped in 2 classes by students, no less. And one student said that my class was so easy, it was a joke. And I really got hurt by that. I said, I'm not trying to make it hard. I'm not trying to make it hard. I know that this is a required course. In some ways, it's an elective, but you have to take a certain number of these courses. It's not. I never intended for the course to be difficult. I intended it to be enjoyable and that you learn something. And I don't want to make knowledge inscrutable. But every time I get to the end of the semester, invariably I'm like, I didn't do that very well. I didn't do that very well. But this class, I've enjoyed you. So I hope that counts for something, because I think when that happens, when I'm enjoying a class, usually it's because I get some, good give and take. Like, how do you like your Nets now? Which is not very much. I don't like them very well at the moment. I got to see if Katie will take me to play golf. But so anyway, I wanted to get that in before too long. I've appreciated I appreciated the way you guys have been mature. I don't know why we have such trouble putting with the hybridization. I think that's a great idea. As a matter of fact, in my earlier class, I said I don't understand why people can't take 2 classes that meet exactly the same time, and you just flip-flop by week. I'll go to this class this week and the next, and record the other one. Like, why can't we do that? How many of you get? I got trapped in my year. I had to take a whole nother year because the one class I needed, they weren't offering until the next year. Have you ever run into that? Then you're forced, because you got 2 classes you have to have at exactly the same time. I can't figure out why we can't be more creative with our students, especially commuters. You guys commuting, right? I don't understand why we can't be more creative, intuitive, entrepreneurial when it comes to this delivery system. I think it might make people happier. And look, all I did was press the record button, and somebody who's had a little emergency is going to be able to listen to it later. If I don't totally screw it up, Brian, which I usually screw it up anyway. But so I wanted to express my gratitude for your attendance, both when we're online and we're here. It's been my best attended class. So I really appreciate that. I think that also has to do with the fact that you guys are more senior, more juniors and seniors and whatnot. Who's graduating? Who's being graduated? One? Anybody else being graduated? No? Juniors? Sophomores? Just kidding. Questions from last time. We talked about, and I ran through it, and I threw so much at you regarding the trial and crucifixion, and I did it quick. I only stayed with you for like an hour and a half, and then I cut it. So I wanted to make sure. I want you to go back to your notes for a minute, take a look, and see what questions you might have, and then we're going to go from crucifixion to Epiphany story. So that's what we're going to do today. But I thought we'd take a minute, look over your notes, and see if there's any giant holes, anything you don't understand, or questions that you legitimately thought I'd cover and I didn't. What? When is the final over? Oh, I don't know that. I don't know it. I usually go with whatever date they give me. One of you wants to look it up. That's what I think. I think it's the 11th. So my only question is whether I'll allow it open for 24 hours. It'll be same thing. Log in once, spend your 4 hours, and then it's going to kick you out. So get it done in 4 hours. And I'm doing that because I love you, And I don't want you sitting there for 8 hours looking for some arcane answer. Just, I once had a professor told me that the final exams were for chemistry majors, and then he failed me. And I was like, that's really nice. It's not true he didn't fail me, but I got a B, and I felt like I failed. So 4 hours, though, is gracious. I'm so that's what I'll do there. I even toyed with the idea of letting you write about the book you read as a question. So be an individual, like, I feel like I felt like maybe I should give you more, like you read the book, you did the work, but then that gives you a final question too, which that might be nice. I don't know if you'd be interested in that or not. But you have to have it read by then, of course, to make sense of it. So, any questions on the crucifixion? Everyone likes to talk about a crucified dude. Sure. Yeah.
It's just because
when we talked about the crucifixion narrative, we talked about how I'm not sure if we talked it or not, but one thing that should have been made clear is how few details there are for such a gruesome event. The other thing that, so that leads me to believe that the actual crucifixion itself was something that the gospel writers were not interested in representing to the reader. That is in complete form with the first century, where crucifixion was a taboo subject. Seneca brings it up only rarely. When we talk about the crucifixion and the trial, I'm trying to think about it. Did someone have your notes up for that? Because that's a long time now too. I know I recorded it. I posted it. We talked about I think we talked about the foot race to the tomb, that there is evidence, the women, the witness of the women at the tomb, that women were not considered to be official legal witnesses. And so their presence at the tomb is interesting and provides the first level of concrete data for the disciples. In all the Gospels, the women are the first ones to get there. Do you guys, someone have your notes out for that? Just give me a quick reminder of a couple of words I said last class. Remember, we had the last class, people in transit. I recorded it, posted it. Online, somebody wants to type and tell me what I'm talking about, that'd be great. I want to make sure that I got it right before I go on to Epiphany Stories. I want to make sure I did say what I wanted to say about the crucifixion. I talked about I talked about Holy Week. I talked about Holy Week. Did I talk about crucifixion? Yeah, I did go through from Palm Sunday to Good Friday. I don't know if I talked about crucifixion. You know that? I went through and talked about the journey from Palm Sunday to Good Friday. I talked about the rationale, how Jesus disappointed all those hopes. The institute, the group is the group on top of the temple site, the Antonia Fortress I talked about. Does anyone have any stuff on crucifixion in your notes? Can't very well do that without doing the other thing first. So I'll just be quick, talk about the crucifixion. The reasons for the crucifixion that we talked about, that is the disappointed hopes of the people, combined with the cleansing of the temple, the collusion of the witnesses, and I said that to something to the point where when the people discover that Jesus has no army behind him, they're naturally disposed to be quite upset. So let's talk about crucifixion. That'll be fun. I'm going to try to just download it. And with your permission, I'll go through this quickly, and then we'll go to the other piece, which is on the resurrection. Let's get this out here. It's one of those days where it's so bright in spots that I can't see straight. Like, it's so bright. When I had the cornea transplant, there was a day when it was really bright and it was snowy, and I almost got hit by a car. I couldn't see going across the street, but that didn't stop me from going across the street. All right, so let's go here, this, share, window. Okay, so we'll start here by asking, and with your permission, I'm going to zip through this. I'm going to kind of go through this quickly. So this presentation is on the module. It says Crucifixion PPTX. You can look that up for yourself if you want to and use that to take notes. The reasons for the crucifixion. First of all, why did the Romans take a role? Because they were the only ones allowed to take a role. It was against Judaism for them to take a life, and it was against Roman rule for anyone else to take a life in punishment. While the Sanhedrin, that is the Jewish high court, was permitted to meet, they were not permitted to hand out an execution. The punishment that they were equipped to hand out was the beatings, the beat you with 39 lashes, and they did that to Jesus. The Apostle Paul says he receives that sentence 5 times. And once he thinks he almost died from it. What was Jesus's mindset about the crucifixion? This is much harder to deal with. You will remember that Jesus meets with his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he asks them to pray with him, Peter, James, and John. What happens? They all fall asleep, right? That's what happens when I'm talking in class or in church too. Everybody falls asleep. I got one guy, in fact, who snores really loud when in church. Like, you'd be sitting there and all of a sudden be like, be like, oh, this is awkward, But I don't want to wake anybody up because who knows what he did last night. He probably needs to be here. So just let him go, whatever he's got to do. Anyway, he says you guys couldn't stay awake and pray for a couple hours, The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And he says to God, if it's possible, allow this cup to pass from me. The cup is the metaphor for judgment. The cup is a metaphor for judgment. When Jesus says, let this cup pass from me, the cup that he refers to is the metaphor of judgment. And I can't remember if I shared this in this class or not. I know I said it in one class I teach, but if you've ever had to drink something to the dregs, do you know what that means? Did I talk this? Okay. I talked about it, used coffee as the illustration, where it's like all the ground. To drink from the cup and to drink it all the way down is to drink a judgment upon oneself. And Jesus asked God, is it possible that we could find another way around this? All the Gospels have something like this embedded within it. How do we understand the idea of sacrifice and punishment as a theological piece? I'm reading a book by a person called Fleming Rutledge right now on crucifixion. It's a delightful book. It's actually all like, but it's good. It's really, really good, and it's 600 pages, so I couldn't prescribe it for class. But in the book, she talks about the distinctions that we miss when we're talking about sacrifice and punishment. Sometimes this degenerates. John Dominic Crozon is one who wants to point this stuff out. He'll say, who is Jesus sacrificed for? Who's the ransom being paid to? He'll say. It's not like Jesus's blood is being paid to the devil. the ransom isn't going to that, and so on he goes. And Fleming Rutledge says that why not within the economy of God and the creation? Or Scripture talks a lot about redemption just on its own without referring to whom the redemption is due. And so theologically, this is one place where the doctrine of the Trinity helps you. Sacrifice, I think, is an important image, for it embodies all of the Old Testament notions, specifically from Leviticus. I know that if you're having trouble sleeping, you read from Leviticus. That's a great idea. Leviticus is not the most entertaining, action-packed book. There's no car chases in Leviticus. But what you do have is a description of the cultus, that is, how the process works. And so the idea of the scapegoat and the sacrificial goat on the Day of Atonement becomes pivotal to the understanding of the cross, Leviticus 16. So Jesus, there's a whole world of difference from Jesus being punished for us, which I cannot get my head wrapped around, and sacrifice, which I can understand. So I still have to do some work on this because I keep going back and forth. It's very easy to think, oh, Jesus was punished for me. And I just don't know how that works theologically. I don't even know how it works morally. In other words, how is it possible that Jesus is being punished for us works for us? How does that work for God? Isn't that incoherent for God? Sacrifice works a whole lot better and a whole lot easier. I can understand sacrifice. The idea of the shedding of blood makes sense in terms of forgiveness and cleansing of sin. The idea of forgiveness in the Bible is very underplayed. Only like 4 or 5 times does it talk about the forgiveness. Jesus himself says in the communion liturgy, right? Remember what I go to do for you. I receive this, the blood of the new covenant shed for you, the blood for forgiveness of sins. He does say that. So theologically, Athanasius of Alexandria once said it this way: the full incarnation of Jesus and his death on the cross was meant so that everything about us as human beings could be atoned for. Atonement, if you split that word up, at one meant, it expresses the intention of the sacrifice. That is, the atonement is meant to bring us close to God through the sacrifice of the victim. The philosopher here is René Girard, Girard. René Girard, who talks about mimetic theory. Mimetic theory is the idea that what our darkest fears, we act out with objects apart from ourselves in order to supply meaning to those dreadful things. So mimetic theory says, I know I'm guilty. I know I deserve this. So I'm going to mimic this in the life of this goat, which I'm then going to sacrifice as punishment. I deserve the sacrifice. I deserve the punishment, but this goat's going to get it. Girard works this whole system out in his philosophical books, and that's actually a book you can make sense of. You want to read an incredibly significant philosopher of the last century. René Girard is one, and this is a book you could probably get your head wrapped around. And in the ancient world, we say we can't separate the religion from the politics in the ancient world, and this is the notion that when Jesus is regarded as a political figure and accused of treason, that there's no, oh, well, he's a Jew, so we have to treat his religion as a part. Politics, religion, economy, they all went together. And so all these things cooperated for Jesus' death. This all of a sudden is becoming very clear. I'm remembering this. So either I did this for some other group or I did this for your class and this is a rehash. Either way, it doesn't bother me. So until you stop me, I'll keep going. This is the picture of the temple. The Gospels all record that in the middle of that temple, tall place right there, is a curtain. And when Jesus is crucified, when he breathes his last, the statement is that the temple veil is ripped in two from top to bottom. Now, the temple veil is probably, I think it's the width of this podium. That's how thick the curtain was. So for it to rip, it's a pretty big thing. It's the drywall of the ancient world. The just fabric. You can see how tall that was. It was one of the things that Julius Caesar wanted to reinstall back in Rome, and that ripped in two. What's implied there is that God's presence is on the loose, where that temple veil kept God's presence behind it in the Holy of Holies. When it rips in two at Jesus' death is when the presence of God is now free to roam about the country. The Roman charge of crucifixion involves humiliation, degradation, and terror. Jesus was accused of being a rebel against Rome, and there are good reasons to think that both Pilate and the Jews who were accusing him knew that this was not, in fact, the case. I've talked about Philo and his understanding about Pilate, how Pilate was a moron and hated the Jews. In the Gospels, we get a version of Pilate cooperating with them. And you can read this on the slide. Now I'm thinking I definitely did this with you guys. Now, as I'm reading this, maybe it was just a few and it's on the recording or something. But now I'm thinking I definitely did this. In any event, you can see here as you read this slide real quick. I mean, there was nothing about Pilate that was endearing to the Jews. And when you read the Gospels, you get the feeling that Pilate's going along with what the Jews wanted. So there's evidence to treat that little piece with a little suspicion. The traditional piece here with the Jesus crucified with the two thieves. This is at the Met, but it could be at the museum I went to in San Antonio. I think it's the Met. Now, the Jewish charge, if the Roman charge was treason, okay, if the Roman charge was treason, the Jewish charge is blasphemy. That is, Jesus would have claimed his messiahship, but Jesus would not have been the Messiah. The Babylonian Talmud writes that Jesus was hanged on the eve of Passover. That goes with the Gospel of John, but not with the others. And this idea that he was paraded around for 40 days, there's no evidence for that. But Jesus was leading Israel astray precisely because Jesus was talking about envisioning and engaging in a non-violent protest. So the signs point in different directions. John's gospel makes the point, the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting and said, what are we to do? The man performing many signs, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation. So the conclusion, Jesus was held to be a false prophet, leading Israel astray. That cleansing the temple was an act of defiance against the central symbol of national life and symbol of Yahweh's presence in the people. Jesus saw himself as a Messiah, even though he had no organized military presence. He did say in the Gospels he could call a legion of angels at his disposal. And Jesus was considered to be a dangerous political nuisance. That, I think, is absolutely true. Jesus pled guilty to the charge, so the prisoner acted out his part. But on the part of the intention of Jesus, when you do the Last Supper, you see that when he talks about the Last Supper, he's acting out this double drama. This is what N.T. Wright suggests also, that he's acting out the part of his last exile and this return. And so this climactic moment when Jesus is going to go as a sacrificial victim, he is reenacting prophetic roles and the imagination. It's a climactic moment for Jesus. He believed that God was bringing the exile to a close. That is the time when God would fulfill his covenant and God would fulfill it through Jesus himself. Do you know that in the Passover was supposed to be a family event? And so if this is the Passover week during this time, so you're supposed to gather with all the family, right? And so Jesus, where's he? He's in Jerusalem. His family presumably is in Galilee, and then which is not crazy because people have made the pilgrimage before, but he's with his disciples. So that reimagined kinship we talked about. Remember how Jesus reimagines kinship? Here he is doing it again. So he identifies his body with the unleavened bread, and the bread. This idea that how long was the bread good for? The manna in Exodus, the manna, 1 day. That's about what my sermons are worth. They're good for 1 day. They're not good after that. They're not good. So I never preach the same one twice, ever, because they're only good for the day. But the manna is only good for the day. And Jesus reimagines his own flesh as being this eternal bread. And the cup is identified with the blood. Jesus' death is to function as the renewal of the covenant, happens by way of the messianic victory. Zechariah, this is where he comes in riding on the colt. All the Gospels indicate that Jesus knew that this would be the last meal he had. He says it in the Gospels. This is the last meal I shall have before I suffer. I got into an argument one time with one of my professors about whether Jesus knew what was in front of him. And my argument went like this. And I used Athanasius. I said, Athanasius says that whatever is not assumed in the flesh of Christ cannot be redeemed. The incarnation, the power and the beauty, I might add, of the incarnation is that God subsumes all of our frailty into God's self. I don't know of a larger human frailty than ignorance and fear of what tomorrow holds. I don't know of a bigger one. My mom is, she's old, and she's been going to the doctor like every 2 weeks now, thinking she's dying. And so she'll call me and she's like, pretty sure it's the big C. And so you know what I'll say? Citrus fruit? No, cancer. Oh yeah, that's a little C though. No, I'm pretty sure it is. And she's gone through every time she goes, the doctor's like, no, you're okay. Everything's good. Your numbers look real good. Everything looks all right. If I have to, that's like, geez, it's like you gotta kick. They kick the tires. You're good for another 100,000 miles. You know. There's nothing more dreadful than the unknown. What does that imply about Jesus? So I made the argument that Jesus didn't know. That the reason he talked about the cup passing is because he didn't know what was in it. Although I do have 3 prophecies that Jesus makes about he's going to go to Jerusalem, suffer and die, and then the 3rd day is going to be raised from the dead, which kind of puts a hole in my boot, but I'll have to get around that some other way. But you know, how would you go? I don't know the answer to this, so I throw it out there for you to consider. How would you go? Like, could you make sense of it if, like, you knew that you were going to die on a Friday, but you were coming back on a Sunday with a different spiritual body? How would you process that? Could you? I don't know if you can. What would you think? Yeah. Did I go over Philippians 2 with you? The Christ hymn? That'll be what I'll end the class with. I remember. Okay, so at some point, this last meal becomes important to Jesus. I talk about the riddle of the cross, the rejected son. Yeah, I know. Now I'm confident that I did this. I just have the terrible memory. But it doesn't hurt to go through it. The idea Jesus envisages himself as the true temple builder coming on no ordinary pilgrimage. This is it. Jesus knows his own understanding of this is going to be a climactic moment one way or the other. I think the thing that I was arguing with my professor about was the way that Jesus was processing his own death. Like, just because Jesus had an understanding of what resurrection might be, does that mean that he knew full-fledged what that death was going to entail? And that's what I said. He couldn't know that. He couldn't know that. Then the next question was, what did Jesus know he was going to be raised from the dead like that? And I said no, because then he'd be different from us. We said he's got to be the same. And if Jesus knew what it was going to be like to be resurrected, then that changes the whole approach to the cross, in my view. Maybe I'm wrong about it. I probably am, but to me, that changes the way you would approach it. You know, I don't know. This is not the right time, nor do I have the time to say it, but I don't know one person that I know in 25 years of doing this who was apprehensive when the day came when they were going to die. I don't know one person. I know people who are sad, but I don't know anybody who was like, this can't be happening like that. There's always there's always a peace. I'm telling you, there's always a peace. If you've been in the room, or if you've been near the room, or if a person close to you's passed, usually it's because of some dreadful illness that's just absolutely demolished a person. But that I don't remember having an experience with a person who's passing where it was like so much disquiet. So from that point of view, could Jesus have a peaceful spirit about it? I think that's true, but I don't know if Jesus could have had a complete idea about it. Now you may think, well, why is he talking about all this stuff? That's the good part of doing theology, is you get to use your imagination along with the scriptural witnesses and the best thoughts about God to process our world. That to me, I don't know, that's tremendous. It's also very fun to begin to exercise your brain this way, to talk about things that really matter. And so Jesus is coming, effectively replacing the temple with his own sacrificial blood. We'll talk about that, the baptism and the cup. Jesus is the true prophet who enacts the arrival of Yahweh as king by doing and saying the things that dovetail with the messianic pieces from Isaiah 40 through 55, the suffering servant motif. And I do know I talked this because I remember telling you that I did a terrible sermon series on this throughout Lent, where I talk about the Isaiah suffering servant passages next to the gospel passages. And so that's still on the YouTube channel. Nothing that I'm going to cover here, but if that's an interest to you, you can check that out. The whole kingdom program of Isaiah 40 through 55 is put into effect through the work of the servant, especially redemptive suffering. That's in Isaiah 52 and 53. So Jesus clearly has this in mind, because as we looked at from Luke 4 is the passage where Jesus takes the scroll and reads it. So this is where Jesus he knows his suffering is coming. He is imagining that suffering dovetails with the suffering servant motif of Isaiah. Yeah, I remember showing you Jesus' taxi. Is that the picture of the cat? There was a Jesus kitty cat. It was a mangy thing, man. So, now, a note about crucifixion. Jesus carries his own cross. Simon of Cyrene is instructed to help carry it for him. They get to the place. Crosses were erected. They were not some high up, lifted up. They were just as much the Roman army was very efficient. And in the efficiency of the army, they knew that they only had to get the cross. They only had to get the cross so high for it to be effective. And so when Jesus goes through the stuff about woman, behold your son, son, behold your mother, when this all happens, Jesus is probably feet off the ground, maybe a foot off the ground. Therefore, it takes on a much more tangible, much more close range situation. When I talk about the crucifixion, I also talk about John 19. In John 19, they take a spear and they pierce Jesus' side, and a sudden flow of water and blood comes out. Jaroslav Pelikan writes Jesus Through the Centuries. It's a work about art. And in the book, he comments about these pictures of Jesus with the pierced side. And the eerie comment he makes is that it looks a lot like female genitalia. And there's no mistaking it when you look at, see, I remember, did I tell you this about going to the Met with the Jesus class? And we're going through, and I'm talking, and I'm trying to be delicate, right? And there's at the Met, there are a number of these paintings. They were all over the place in the medieval world. So I say, what does that look like? And this guy is looking at it, and the girl's looking at it. Hey, it's a big class, And then I watch the guy, and this is what happens. Right? In real time. So it's like, so I go, you just saw it. He goes, I hope not. And so I say, now why is the image there? Because the sudden flow of blood and water accompanies a birth. John's gospel, everything is symbolic. We didn't study John's gospel, which is a real regret. But the class is for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'm not sure why they did that, but that's fine. John's gospel, everything's symbolic. It's the birth of the church. The birth of the church is the pierced side of Jesus. Did I tell you that I had the short straw? I had to preach the text, "Woman, behold your son." What the 7 last words of Jesus on Good Friday? You have to preach these words, and so I meet with another pastor, and we do the service. What are you supposed to say about that? Usually, people say this is Jesus telling Mary that John is her new son. So I said, there's nothing in the text that merits that. I said, it's Jesus saying to his mother, look at what you got. And I said, what mother can possibly look at that? We thought he'd be a doctor. I mean, you have to be a little absurd to make sense of the passage. So what I said in my remarks was that when Jesus calls for this, he's calling for us to look at the cross as the world apart from grace. That is, the world apart from the grace of God. There's no grace on a cross. There's no freedom on a cross. There's no forgiveness on a cross. There's no mercy on a cross. There's no future on a cross. But then on the other side of the empty tomb, that's the world full of grace. All you have is the freedom of God to move. You've got a new day at the beginning of the day, at the beginning of a new week. All you have is possibility and the encouragement that Jesus provides. That leads us, of course, to talk about the Epiphany Stories. Let's see if this will work. So this is what could this be but an area of around the Galilee. And why am I showing you this spot? This is a spot where people think that perhaps Jesus was cooking the fish here in John 21 as the disciples were out fishing again. Now, I think I showed you at the very beginning of class how that miracle in John 21, where Jesus says, throw the net on the other side of the boat. We've been out here fishing all night. You're going to tell us how to fish? We haven't caught a thing. Just throw your nets on the other side of the boat. and then they pull up a catch so big it almost capsizes the boat. The same miracle is in Luke's Gospel, chapter 4 or 5, I think, where it's before the resurrection scene, and they have to get people with them to help them in with the large catch of fish. People think it occurs at this space. How far away was the boat? The Galilee is a pretty big lake. We didn't have the good fortune to come upon it in such good weather. These are pictures from another friend who went when it was sunny. When we went, there was a little storm kicked up, and I was looking for Jesus to come and calm it, but that didn't happen. There's like a little white caps on the thing, and it's pretty wild. But nonetheless, that's what the fishing boat may have looked like. Who knows? This is the actual fish boat that they found. I apologize for the picture. Okay, it's because people are wobbly. That's why it's like if they want somebody to help out in Ukraine, I can't see straight and I'm a little jittery, but I'll go. What could possibly go wrong? So this is the fishing boat. This is a boat that they uncovered from the mud of the Galilee. It's a first century fishing boat. It is about as it would go from the diagonal to the diagonal in the room, and it would be about 6 feet across. They would use sail, but they would also have place for the oars in case they got stuck. So that's the kind of a boat you would look at. And Galilean fisherman's house here. It's funny how after Jesus is to the cross and the empty tomb, where do you find the disciples next? They're back in the Galilee, like, well, I guess we got to start working for a living. I mean, it's funny how things change. You don't get the full story. You get the zeroed in picture of the Gospels. I have to believe that there were episodes over the 3 years that they spent with Jesus, where they went home and did the work that they were required to do, and they did the things that they were required to do. Nonetheless, here's another picture of, this is in Capernaum. And so this is some of the evidence from that space. This is the Jordan River. I just think that looks like Morro Bay, California. Anybody ever been to Morro Bay? Well, I highly recommend it. All right. It's always been thought that the empty tomb stories were apologetic. You know what I mean by apologetic? Meant to defend the faith. But apologetic means to defend the faith. So the stories were concocted in a way to defend the faith and late in composition. So if the Gospels are written between 68 and 98, then the Epiphany and Resurrection stories are at the very end of the composition title. But it's remarkable that the empty tomb stories were granted by the witness of women. All the Gospels have women first. In Mark and Matthew, no man sees the empty tomb at all. But in Luke and in John, it's different. In Luke and John, in Luke, Peter goes. And in John, you've got Peter, and then it says the disciple that Jesus loved, which people think is John, but we're going to argue that it's not the John you think. It's not the original James, John, Peter. It's John the elder who crops up later on. It's not a real important. Richard Balcom is the guy who writes this in the book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Very good stuff. I think he's on to something. Not on something, on to something. But if you ever watch Richard Balcom give a presentation on YouTube or something, this is the way it works. Ready? I'm going to show you. You have to watch because you're not. This is the way he gives lectures in person too. And when you're talking to him in person, this is what he does. And he's talking, and he never makes eye contact. It is the most bizarre thing. So one time, he's like looking all over the place, and I'm like, "Whoo!" Trying to see. He wouldn't do it. That's because I'm a pain in the neck. That's why. You don't want to sit by me in anything serious because it's not going to go well. So if one can talk about a miracle story, the resurrection is the miracle story. A great many of the men with a statement about the witnesses who stand around and see these things. There's a type of choral ending which bundles the witness of those who see it as a mighty act of God. No resurrection story has a response of bystanders at all. So in ancient Greek chorus, you've got the receivers of messages that, I've got a typo in that one sentence. And the messengers at the end of a Greek tragedy or comedy, you'll see people talk about, oh, this was the action of God, a whole chorus. You don't get that in the Gospels. You don't get no resurrection story has a response of bystanders. If there's one that could, it would be Matthew, right? Because Matthew, you learn, Pilate has stationed a couple of guards by the tomb. But you don't get any of their words. So instead, all of the stories and these visions are directed to a small and select group of people. There's no crowd involved at all. Now, the notion of the women is interesting in a couple of respects. It's the women on whose witness the empty stories depend. In a Jewish context, to designate women as witnesses was an act of folly because they're not going to, you can't admit them as witnesses in court. How convincing could they be if the inventions were all backed up by those who weren't qualified by law to bear witness in the courtroom? So this may point, in fact, as a piece of, there are some prospective students. Should I yell at them to go somewhere else? I used to do that all the time. And then I had an admissions person, one of the people that gives tours, in one of my classes. And I'm like, please don't do that. It's hard enough to walk people around. Right? Like, go somewhere else. No one thinks that's that funny. Matthew and Mark may be genuine simply because the only witness they provide is the women. And Mark doesn't even have an Epiphany story. You remember, right? The shorter ending of Mark. So, I mean, so what you're getting, you see, is a real piece of ancient text. That's my view. Theologically, many tombs can be attributed to the time of Jesus in Jerusalem by way of archaeology. And there are several things that are remarkable. First, inscriptions are not made in Hebrew or Aramaic, but in Greek. That to me is fascinating. I still can't figure that out. Okay. Yeah, I can. One thing is that people in the diaspora would speak Greek. So if they're coming back to be buried in Jerusalem on holy ground, they're going to put Greek in the tombstone. Many of the old diaspora would go there to die. This would make them close to the holy city. There are traditions in Judaism that many of the great prophets were buried in Jerusalem. The Jewish tradition with the expectation of an eternal or afterlife is very common. Important that the graves and tombs would be venerated. I showed you a picture of that, right? The tombs of yes, I did. The Kohanim, the prophets' tombs. It was all white. It was all limestone across this mountain. I said that what you can't see is that those are all like burial markers. And so a lot of people were buried there. Could have been possible to allocate the tomb of Jesus to the realm of the rest of the holy ones. That would be super easy to do, you see. It would have been super easy for Jesus' disciples to find a way to bury him and honor him and pay homage to what he had done. Can you smell what I'm cooking there? That would have been easy for them to do because it had been done regularly and ad nauseum. Big time teachers are buried in that section. You could go back and find them to the first century. This is not what happened. There's my image. Now I'm thinking maybe I did show this to you, but I'm blissfully ignorant. So if I ever get like Alzheimer's and I'm still teaching, I'll get to the last class and be like, all right, we're going to talk about the Gospel of Mark. 16 straight lectures of the Gospel of Mark. And the students will be like, okay, it's the last class though. We didn't get very far. That's the Kohanim, the Valley of the Kohanim, the Holy Ones. And that's what I meant. It's taking all that kind of, yeah. So, yep. So, this is the point. That if they had wanted to honor Jesus, which would have been totally appropriate to do, with a marker that everyone could find and pay homage to, You could get it done very, very easily. All of those are graves, all of them on that hill. And the point is, there are so many that we recognize from the first century, from the Greek inscriptionary evidence, that would have been totally in line. So what I'm trying to do, I'm building to a crescendo, is that there's something in place already. So if they wanted to take the body off of the cross and then inter that body in a place where he could be venerated, there was a possibility that could be done. What is the obvious hitch in the giddy up? Well, that's very obvious. Let's say they had a body. The Jewish authorities would have pitched a fit. He was crucified because he was a blasphemer. So to throw him in the valley of the holy ones would have been, you crazy. What I'm suggesting is it would have been possible for them to figure out. It's not crazy that they could find a place. Early Christians not attributed to a tomb or to its veneration. Jesus does not lie with Isaiah or any other prophets. That's not the point. They do say that the hallowed ground of Jerusalem is not where Jesus belongs. That's a super, super important point. Jerusalem can't hold Jesus. And so that's a theological statement as well. I remember doing this too. Maybe I just did it really fast. Okay, well, this exists. The text exists. I'm going to just get a couple of the things I think are important, then I'll get to the end, and then I'll take stock of where we are. So with the appearance stories, one thing that I always try to point out to students is that there's this discomfort with no one seems to know who Jesus is. Did I go through that with you? Like Mary thinks he's the gardener. How does she make this mistake? How do the two guys on the road to Emmaus not know who Jesus is? He's standing right there. So I always was vexed with this problem. And so I went back to 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul talks about the resurrection. And when he does so, he talks about a spiritual body. And I write about this in the book that sold dozens, that there's a spiritual body that the person is resurrected to, which explains on the one hand how Jesus can pass through walls. He's also unique in this. There's no other people who have been granted this. But it explains why Mary and the others have trouble identifying Jesus. What it doesn't explain is how Jesus is able to shift his appearance around to the point where they can see his wounds like Thomas does. So there are a lot of anomalies here that I can't make sense of. The Emmaus story is super interesting. Luke 24, where the two guys are going along the road and Jesus pops up in their midst. And Jesus asks them, why are you guys so sad? And he goes, you're just a new person to Jerusalem. You don't understand. Jesus, we thought he was the Messiah. He's dead, and what are we going to do? And some people say they stole his body away, And Jesus walked through the Old Testament and showed them all the places where the Messiah had to suffer and die and be raised from the dead. And I promise every time I talk about that story, I think I wish I could have been a fly on the wall for that lesson. And then, just to understand what that means. Does it mean that Jesus lived his life with the intention of making those things true? Or does it mean that Jesus organically had those things come true as a prophecy will unfold? In other words, is it self-fulfilling prophecy what Jesus does, or is it a piece of legitimate? These are questions we don't get the answers to. The amount of ascension is interesting, is where Jesus is. I know I told you about that when I used my Jesus action figure and had him ascend through the picture. That was hilarious. Not too many people laughed, though. I have to be honest. It was not. I thought that was a good bit. It didn't go very far. But the ascension of Jesus marks the point that now the earth can no longer contain God. God is all resuming his pre-existent status. So he goes out to Bethany and lifts up his hands and he blesses them. He was blessing them, he withdrew. You can read this part about the enthronement epiphanies. That is that Jesus is given this authority. Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay. Paul uses this Greek word ophe. Mark does too. And it describes this notion of the availability of the risen Jesus to be seen. At this point, I'm killing this. And I'm going to go to Bible Gateway. See what ads come up? We're blessed to have this incredible Wi-Fi at work here. Okay. 1 Corinthians 15 is called the resurrection chapter. In the resurrection chapter, you may have gotten this when you did your Jesus and Paul piece. There was a little couple of videos that I had for you to watch on Jesus and Paul. What I want to draw your attention to is this first series of verses. By the way, 15 is where you get the notion of the spiritual body. Now I would remind you, brothers and sisters, of the good news that I proclaimed to you, which you in turn received, in which you stand, through which also you are being saved, if you hold firmly to the message that I proclaimed to you, unless you have come to believe in vain. For I handed on to you as of first importance. By the way, am I sharing this? I don't think I'm sharing this. Sorry. For I handed on to you as of first importance of what in turn I received. So this is what Paul is saying is the prominent pieces. What did Paul preach when he went to a church? That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. That he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. So Paul makes mention of the fulfillment passages from the Old Testament scriptures. There was no New Testament, right? When Paul writes 1 Corinthians, there's no such thing. There's not even a gospel written. So Paul is trying to explain this. Then, now look what happens next. He appeared to Cephas, that's Peter. Cephas is the Aramaic for rocky. Petros is rocky, Cephas is rock. He appeared to Cephas. Then to the 12. By the way, Peter appears in Luke and in John. Then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. That's a lot of people. Then he appeared to James. Then, who is James? That's the brother of Jesus. That's the brother of Jesus, the leader of the Jerusalem church, Acts chapter 15. Then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me, for I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. For the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me has not been in vain. Humble brag. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them. So this is tantalizing, isn't it? Who are among these 500 when Paul says that most of whom are still alive? That is Paul saying, You can check my sources. There's no, he names names, right? What happens here? If Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? Now, this chapter gets it exactly the reverse of what you and I might want for Easter Sunday. What we want for Easter Sunday is somebody to make sense of the empty tomb. But what Paul does is he starts with the empty tomb as the foundation of the ensuing argument. So he's not trying to convince you or me that Jesus is risen from the dead. We take that as fact. Why do we take that as fact? Look at all the people that participated in seeing him alive. Now, what does he say? So you cannot say there is no resurrection from the dead. To a Greek audience in Corinth, this means that the idea of Hades with its ferryman and all of the trappings of myth are thrown out the window. That the resurrection of the dead is something we can expect. And he says, if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. Then those also have died in Christ have perished. That is what you see here is for Paul. Everything hinges on this. The whole thing turns on this piece of data, which is why he says he has all these people who are witnesses to it. Can't you see the Apostle Paul when he writes this? The Apostle Paul, when he writes this, is admitting that he experienced the risen Christ in a strange way, in a vision on the side of a road where the 500, Peter, James, the other disciples saw him face to face. And Paul is trying to reckon the fact that he did not. But the presence of Christ is just as real. One thing about Scripture is it's brutally honest. And this is where Paul gets at it. He says, if Christ has not been raised, then the whole thing we're dealing with is just a complete joke. Everything depends on the empty tomb. There were places the disciples could have put the body and waited. There are places where they could have put the body and experienced kind of a place where they could go venerate him. None of that ever existed at any time. The 1-year anniversary of his death, they would have gone to collect the bones and put them in a bone box. About 15 years ago, they're called ossuaries. They collected an ossuary that said, Jesus bar Joseph. And we found it. And I think, okay, yeah, you found it. You found a 3rd century bone box. That's Jesus, a very common name. It'd be like Bill Smith in some respects. These are very common names. And it was out of archaeological sink and the whole rest. But the point that Paul makes is that everything in the Christian faith depends on it. So the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is not an ancillary teaching. This is the biggest criticism I have with Marcus Borg and with John Dominic Crozet, because they relegate this to some kind of parabolic function. That is, this is just a picture. It's not real. It's symbolic. Of course, we venerate his presence. He goes around with us just like my uncle Frank does. The N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, not a page under 1,000 pages. I read the whole thing, okay? At no point does N.T. Wright countenance such issues, other than to demolish the argument. But see, that's not good. Who cares? It's an argument, right? We're talking about reality. What's more believable? When's the last time you saw a corpse get up and walk away? I did a funeral for a guy the other day. It was in an urn, so I didn't have to make sure he was dead. You know what I mean? Like sometimes when they're laying there, you just got to make sure everybody's good before you go throw them in the ground. This wasn't the case. So Jesus, they didn't have that. They never did that. They never found that body. They never venerated it as such. There's no body that they ever found or suspected to find. What does that mean? They threw him in the lake? I don't know how to explain it. But I do know that it's unlikely that they all got together and got on one story and stuck to it. I think the illustration that I give here is from the Watergate scandal person, Chuck Colson, who said that in Watergate, they had 3 guys who were supposed to keep the secret. They got together and said, look, if we don't tell, no one knows. All they have is allegations. They'll never prove a thing. And so they agreed. They wouldn't say anything, and so they were going through the hearings and whatnot, and they stuck to the guns for 3 days. And then the cat was out of the bag, and all of them went to prison, except for Nixon. Colson says, now we were dealing with regular issues, which would have been easy to keep secret. We would have all gone free, and one of us cracked. You're telling me that 12 disciples, 500 after that, all got on the same page, and no one cracked and said they actually threw his body in the lake? Over 40 years? So I had a teacher named Ulrich Mauser, who is really great. He's at Princeton, and boy, I loved him. He was great. His name, means mouse. And he was this little guy. And he would open up the lectures. I am such a little Mauser. And he would, then talk about, he was a preeminent scholar. And he talked about the resurrection of Christ. He was he had taken classes with Rudolf Bultmann, okay? So he was the real deal. And I'll never forget this. He's talking about the resurrection of Jesus. And he's trying to maintain himself as he's talking about it. And he says this, I don't know what to say except one thing. He starts to tear up. You can go to the cemetery, but you'll never find Jesus in the places of the dead, for he's not there. That's all he said about it. And so I thought, and I kept thinking, like, of all the places, Princeton is a place you could speak your mind, but he couldn't do it, but he knew it. And so his word was that way. That was a powerful moment in that little class. For Paul, it meant everything. Everything in the Christian faith hinges on this. If you find the body, now somebody said, well, what happens if you find out Jesus was married? I'd be like, that just is more because he didn't sin. That's amazing. That's a true miracle right there. Telling me he was married and didn't sin? My goodness. He's even, you have to be God. Do that. That's a little marriage joke. But when you look at the ramifications of providing some kind of evidence for a physical body of Jesus that you could discover, that's a tough call. Okay. Now, in the few minutes that remain, I want to address, I'm going to go to Philippians 2, and then I'd like to talk for just a few minutes at the close of class, try to entertain questions that you might have. Questions about faith, Bibles, church, whatever it is, whatever questions you have, general, specific, whatever. And that's the way we'll close it out. A class like this opens you up to other things. A class like this opens you up to the possibility of studying scripture at a higher level, or studying theology at a higher level, or both. I chose both. I couldn't figure out. First, I started in Old Testament. So I learned my Hebrew, I learned all that stuff, and that was in my seminary days. And then I thought, well, I'm going to switch gears and do the New Testament. And I did the New Testament, but I also did systematic theology with people like Tom Torrance and Karl Barth and Karl Rahner. Karl Rahner's mom said, I'll read Karl Rahner when he writes in German, which is a Karl Rahner joke because he wrote in German. But then I studied New Testament, and that's where I've landed. But Christology and theology have their impetus in Christ. When you see Jesus, here's my big theological point that will never disappoint you, no matter what comes against it, okay? When you see Jesus, you see all there is to see of God. Jesus is the full revelation of God. You don't see any more of God when you study nature. That's a big shortcoming among Catholic theologians. Let's go look at the Analogia Entis, or let's go look at the revelation of what nature. I'm not looking to nature. If I look to nature, I'm looking at survival of the fittest. That's not helpful. But when I see Jesus, I see all there is to see, God. Systematic theology is the investigation of theology in a systematic lens. You study God the Creator, God the Redeemer, God the Reconciler, and you study those pieces, and along the way you study redemption. There is no redemption apart from Christ. So you can study Christ, you can study theology from that point of view. I want you to see how Paul deals with Jesus. This is essential. I think it's one of the most beautiful and enigmatic statements about Jesus in the whole Bible. Paul seems to indicate that you can share in the mind of Christ. Let's see if I can get the last chapter. At the end of chapter 1, Paul says, "Only live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent and hear about you, I will know that you are standing firm in one spirit, striving side by side with one mind for the faith of this gospel, and are in no way intimidated by your opponents." What's the gospel? The gospel is the message about Jesus, about what Jesus came to do to fulfill God's covenant, to bring redemption and salvation from sin and the judgment of God. The question is, saved from what? Jesus is the Savior. Saved from what? Saved from the judgment of God. That on the cross, when the temple veil rips, the presupposition is that at that very moment is when God saves us from ourselves and from the ramifications and the power of sin. He says, "We are no way intimidated by your opponents. For them is the evidence of their destruction, but for your salvation. And this is God's doing. For he has graciously granted you the privilege not only of believing in Christ, but of suffering from as well, since you are having the same struggle that you now saw I had and still hear that I have. If then there is any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion and sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition." If you were going to ask me what Paul's definition of sin is, it's right here. "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let the same mind," this is an incredible sentence, "let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus." Who? So what kind of mind are we looking at? Who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited for his own purposes, but emptied himself. So verse 6 speaks to Jesus' pre-existence. Paul believes that Jesus existed in the fellowship of God the Father before he became flesh. So before the incarnation, incarnatus say, that is, enfleshment of Jesus, Jesus existed with the Father. Jesus didn't count that status as something to hold on to, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. People call this the Christ hymn, and they suppose that Paul couldn't have written it because it's too sophisticated. Like, I'm a Paul scholar. That's my number one area of pursuit. Like, oh, why not? I think it makes perfect sense to have the Apostle Paul being able to. If you tell me he knows the Psalms in the Greek, then he could definitely compose this, right? Look at what it says. It speaks to the pre-existence of Jesus in verse 6. But the willing emptying, the self-emptying. Why does Paul say that Jesus took the form of a slave? So just by virtue of his human nature, you think that that suggests slavery. Okay. Right. So the exchange. Mhm. Right. Hmm. Do you ever do an all-nighter? You ever have to pull an all-nighter? Yeah. You become a slave to your body at some point, and you can't stay awake, and you fall asleep, and you wake up, and you're like, what am I doing in the garden? So you know what's amazing is I didn't think you would come up with it necessarily, but you did come up with it categorically, which is fascinating to me, because one of the things people always say is, well, it's sometimes the gospel is so complicated, and New Testament study is so complicated. I'm always saying, it's kind of straight ahead. If you read the words and read them with open eyes, you're going to get the gist of it. You're correct in your observations. The one thing I'll point out that sways the thing is the way he died. Jesus' death was the slave's death. Crucifixion was reserved for slaves and traders. So maybe that was lurking somewhere in your head without the confidence that I have. You may have oh, that can't be. That's it. It's his death on the cross presents Jesus as a slave in that respect. But in other respects, it's exactly right. He becomes a slave to the human nature he had. He was there at the beginning of creation. He created the whole universe. And there he is. In my Good Friday meditation, I said, the one who was there at the beginning of creation, the one who created the whole universe through the power of his word, John chapter 1, cannot move. He's pinned to a cross. Think about that for ironic. From a theological point of view, right? And from a very physical point of view. Like, when you start to put these images together, think about this. In the Easter message, because there was a part 1 and a part 2. The Good Friday message was part 1. No one watched either one. So, but in the way I wrote it, I said on the Good Friday service, Jesus has his pile of clothes that they take off of him. There's enough clothing there that they divide it up, it says, into 4 groups, Luke chapter 22. 4 groups of people get a parcel of clothing. That means Jesus is exposed in the cross, as would normally happen. Sans clothing. All right, so they're divvying up his clothes, but they don't want to rip the tunic. They say they don't want to rip the tunic, okay? Now, Jesus is taken off the cross and put in burial cloths, right? Into the tomb he goes. Now, empty tomb, here come the women. What do they all spot? There's one thing that's in the tomb. What is it? Yeah. Yeah, the burial clothes, for lack of more nuance. We're not sure what it ultimately looked like, the shroud or whatever they say. It's the burial clothes. But they're folded. So I say Jesus didn't leave his clothes hanging around. He's a little tidy, Which begs the question that when Jesus is in the garden and he sees Mary, what's he wearing? Now think about it. You're right. John's gospel begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Nothing was there before God, and everything was created through the Word, right? It's a direct quotation from Genesis 1. There are 7 miracles. There are 7 discourses, all to evoke a sense of creation. We didn't study John. I need a whole course to study John. But then you get to the garden where the tomb is. And Mary presupposes that Jesus is the gardener, which is exactly where the problem started in Genesis 3, was in a garden. In Genesis 3, the human situation is such that their sin provokes them to shame because they were naked. No clothes. Here comes Jesus. Mary doesn't bat an eyelash, and there's no mention of his clothing. I think that's why there's no mention of his clothing, is to evoke the sense that the shame has been reversed. The shame of that situation has been reversed. John's gospel wants to call attention to that. So does Luke. The new creation has begun. That's why at the end of the gospel it says, it is finished, tetelestai. It's exactly the same word that ends Genesis chapter 1 in the Septuagint. Tetelestai, it is finished. And then God rested from his labor. So all that to say that the way that John's gospel and the gospels put Jesus is way more going on than you and I usually recognize. We usually read the Bible in a smudge. Oh, read that book, on to the next one. That's kind of the way we read stuff. I did that this morning. I was reading on the subway, and I'm like, I was reading through a chapter. I'm like, hey, I got that chapter. And I'm like, you fool, you didn't, just take your time. If it's not worth reading, if you're going to read it that way, it's not worth reading. Don't waste your time on it. Find something you really want to read. So John positions Jesus as this one who has begun the new creation, reversing the old. Started in a garden, it's going to end in a garden, right? So that's a little. He takes the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, being found in human form. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. This is what Paul means by saying that God is faithful and that Jesus is faithful. The faithfulness of Jesus Christ. Sometimes we render that in the Greek, the faith in Jesus Christ, which is a misreading. It's Jesus' faithfulness. If Jesus isn't faithful to the cross, none of what we do matters. You can believe all day long in a glitter sneezing unicorn, and it's not going to mean one bit that glitter sneezing unicorn exists and you can worship it. Belief has to have a tangible, objective component. The objective side of God's grace is Good Friday. You can't do anything about that. Once and for all, Jesus entered into time and space and affected for the world a universal salvation. I always point out to people, they say, well, I don't know if I believe it. You know what? God doesn't care what you believe. He did it already. It's done. This is what I don't get about Christianity. There's so much, people load so much on my, do you think what I do changes what God has done? I could sit here and stamp my foot all day to 10 years and say, nope. And God's already done it. It doesn't matter. That's for a different day and a different class. But look at what it says. This is to emphasize this point. Therefore, God also highly exalted Jesus and gave him the name that's above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess, especially only those who say they believe in him. It doesn't say that. There is no, it says every. Every knee should bend. Where? In heaven, on earth, and under the earth. Living, what's above the earth in heaven? The not living yet. The ones yet to be born. What's on the earth? Those who are present. What's under the earth? Those who have died. Paul envisions a cosmic Christ that radically changes the universe because of his resurrection from the dead. Every knee should bend. Every tongue confess. When I do a funeral, I put the fun in funeral, But when I do the funerals, I'll say something like this, your no is not going to undo God's yes. You can say no to God all the time. God still says yes to you. And there's nothing you can do about it. Because on Good Friday, that was done. That's the objective side. Now, there is a subjective side. The light of the world that shines, if Jesus is the light of the world that shines is my eyes being open to that reality. Why don't the light go on for everybody at the same time? I can't answer that question. But I like this. Every knee should bend, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. The yeses, the nos, the not so sures. So I end this part of our time with that, because it opens to us the broader significance of the historical Jesus, along with the theological center of the cross and Jesus's resurrected status. Sometimes I wonder how much of this, like, is it? But I never know the right balance to strike in this class between like the historical Jesus, the Gospels, the parables, the kingdom of God. Then you've got this whole systematic wing that I very rarely cover any at all. And I'm thinking, geez, that's like a pretty significant piece. As we close our class out, I wonder if you've brought some questions for me. I have a little bit of time today. I don't have to run out the door. And so, but you know, I also know that doesn't really matter too much. So what are your questions? What questions do you have for me? Yeah, did you bring any? Do Mormons and Christians worship the same God? I can't answer that really well, but I can say that the stories that the Mormons have in the Book of Mormon are just radically different. So I've read little pieces of the Book of Mormon. So I can't say that. I don't want to be indelicate, but I don't. I think that the departure in Mormonism from the conciliar faith is really, really large. I'll put it that way. The departure is really, really large. Yeah. Yeah, and preach to the Indians, and yeah, I just, you know, there are other things in there that, like, every person who's a Mormon will receive a planet to rule in the afterlife. And I mean, he's a good friend of mine. He was a good friend of mine. And he was a Mormon, and he had his phone, and he had a picture of a planet on his phone. So what did then I said, hey, Clint, is that the planet you're going to rule? That was the end of that. He was on his phone. Yeah. It's just so vastly different than, you know, Christianity. But the other thing about Christianity is there's no secrets. You know? The only thing secret is stuff you just don't bother wanting to know. In Mormonism, there's whole bunches of stuff that no one can learn unless you ascend the ranks. That troubles me, just on the face of it. So that's my response about that. Do I know a lot of really nice and good Mormons? You bet I do. Yes, I do. Like I said, I got some good friends who are Mormons, and we agree in terms of some moral things. I lost a lot of friends in the quote unquote evangelical world over the last 4 years. I'd kind of been leaving that world, and I lost a lot of Mormon friends too in that same that dust up that we've experienced. So that's a good question. I'm not sure how to answer it any better though. So other questions? That was a good one. Yeah. Yeah, the question is about most Muslims say that Jesus can't be God because God cannot die. That's not the only thing. There are some other things that God cannot have a son. So God cannot have a son. However, there are so many pieces in the Quran that extol Jesus, that celebrate Jesus as a prophet. They also wonder about the virgin birth. That's an impossibility. The question about, how can God die is, I see this is the other thing we didn't have time to look at, is that if you want to do you know how you go on ancestry.com and they tell you who you're related to? Okay, if you want to do an ancestry.com thing with heresy, all you have to do with heresy is ask the question, or the primary question is, what is the nature of Jesus? That is where you get all your heresies. So the first one is Jesus less than God, because of course he dies, so he has to be less than God. So the councils at Nicaea and Chalcedon say, no, he dies as a result of the crucifixion, but he dies as a sacrifice according to God's plan. Therefore, he enters into human experience, as Athanasius will say, and he subsumes death. Death has been overcome because he enters into it and takes it away. He bears it away on his back. So death becomes not something that Christians shy away from in regard to the Trinity, but essential to it. So in terms of Islam, it's not a criticism that they should point that out. But it is something to say that that's a particular theological point, that the suggestion that God cannot die is simply an approximation of theism from a Greek point of view, that I think even the Christian church is trying to square up against. The Greek point of view is God cannot change. It's called the impassibility of God. God cannot change. Death implies change. Therefore, Jesus cannot be God. That's the way that it works. So the problem is in the initial foundation, what does change mean when it is applied to God? And is it appropriate to use the verb change when change is usually approximated to shift over time, when God experiences no time because God has created it? So that's not a word play. It's not a word game. It's trying to be precise in our theological language. So do I understand the way Islam speaks of Jesus? And yes, they get that. The Quran is written about 700 AD. So between 3 and 600 AD, the Christian church is trying to sort that issue out. So there are a bunch of churches, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, where they're battling this very issue in the church itself. So that explains to a certain extent where it comes from in the Quran too, historically. It comes from those antecedents, Nestorianism, Ebionitism, those two versions of the heresy. But Athanasius turns that into strength and says that whatever Jesus assumes, he redeems. So there's no more God thing to do than enter into our death. Who's that theologian says, all the non-gods go and the real God shows up. And the real God shows up even in our most broken. And so that to me is an endearing quality, not something that is to be, shied away. That's a good, but I always trip students up. I don't say always because I probably won't do it here, but I'll put 3 statements. Which of these statements is not in the Bible? And one's from the Quran. Invariably, somebody will pick something from the Gospel of Mark. Like, sucker. But I don't, that was mean. I shouldn't do that. A lot of good things. The Quran has a lot of good things to say about Jesus. Other questions? Depends on the Jew. That's really a true statement too. I know Claudia Setzer. I know Daniel Boyarin, Mark Nanos. These are Jewish New Testament scholars. So they put Paul and they put Jesus in the first century, and they treat Paul and Jesus within Judaism. That's a very good, healthy process in New Testament and biblical scholarship. We have a hard time because when the train leaves it's like C.S. Lewis says, Jesus is either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. That's putting it in austere terms. But you can't call Jesus a good teacher and then have him lie about his resurrection. So, I know people were like, what is it? A lot of Jews think that Jesus was a blasphemer, that Jesus' own notions about who he was misguided at best. I know some Jews who think that Jesus was crazy and that he had dysphoria of some sort of mindset that allowed his disciples to follow along with him too. After all, we can look around very close and find evidence of people who follow around idiots and do all the things that Trump says anyway. I'm sorry, did I say that? Or like Putin. Think about that. The way that the people have just lined up is just I think you'd be safe to say that you never thought you'd see the day when. Here it is. Yeah. So, but now my friends, my Jewish friends always have a healthy respect for Jesus, though, because of the teaching that he gives. So it's a kind of a strange tug there, And here's what they say: Jesus was a good teacher, he's a good man, did miracles, but his disciples X, Y, Z. That's how they get around that. The Babylonian Talmud was not so delicate. It just said that. Sorry, maybe I've missed it. Jesus, have I missed it? The Babylonian Talmud is less delicate. It says that Jesus had 5 disciples and worshiped Satan. So that's pretty austere. One more. Yes. There is a thing called the bosom of Abraham that some Jews believe in. That is like a kind of a quasi paradise for faithful Jews. The question is, who gets to go? Because without the temple, there's no sacrificial system. Without sacrificial system, are they still enmeshed in sin? This is a big, big question. So at the outset, when the temple is destroyed, the rabbis qualify following Torah and sacrifice through the observance of the Torah, and so it's not sacrifice literally anymore. It's doing these deeds. There are a fair amount of Jews who believe in just kind of like an annihilationism, which is kind of like this is our heritage, but not really. They don't necessarily believe in an individualistic, conscious-based afterlife. That's, if I had to go with one, that's, I think, probably 75 to 80% of that way. Honor God, but it's the Psalms that say the dead can't praise you. The Psalms say that. So even in the Old Testament, there's this idea that the afterlife is pretty much not a thing. It's kind of when you start to look at it, I say, when you start to read the Bible closely, you're like, wait, what did I just read? Especially when you read it in the Hebrew. Well, I want to thank you for being, like I said, a wonderful class. I'm available to you anytime, even after the class is over, sometime down the road. Something comes up, you have a question about this or that, you're trying to figure out what master's program to enter into for theology, or if you need a reference or something like that, you can let me know. The other thing I always tell students is, for some reason, students reach out after this with some kind of either a life issue, or I followed I followed 2 ordinands, and the one ordinand didn't. He decided it wasn't for him, and he was in my New Testament class, and he got back in touch, and he was like, "I'm just, he feels like I failed the church." I'm like, why do you think that? You shouldn't think that, But people get in touch with me on a regular basis. You shouldn't feel funny or like that. That's the most honoring thing for professors, especially in a theology or religion class. So whatever it is, you may get a picture of a kitty cat on the Remind app from time to time. It may happen. So feel free to opt out of those messages, obviously. And the other thing I say is you're always welcome to participate in the digital interface with the churches that I serve. That's easy to find if you want to find it, and you're more than welcome to do that. So look for announcements, including the list of topics and how to explore those topics for the final quiz, and then the specific times. I'll have the specific times for the quiz as well. In the meantime, I hope the end of the semester goes well and that you have an enjoyable break. All right? That's it.
Isn't it listing like that, kind of like a review sheet of sorts for the final quiz, like
Well, it won't necessarily be a review sheet. There might be already something on there, in fact. But it'll be you're welcome, and take care. Let me shut this off.